So, as you know, the Prime Minister lays out his roadmap to unlock tomorrow. What's the most encouraging data?
I think a lot of the data is very encouraging, particularly the indicators about admissions to hospital and deaths and so on. But just to come back to the way you started this, I think the change in rhetoric is interesting. We always were told to follow the science. Now it's follow the data, data, not dates. But I should say the trouble is with that use of follow, it encourages the idea that there's going to be some kind of algorithm that, essentially, if we look at the data, it'll tell us exactly what will happen and when. But Matt Hancock, and when you were talking to him earlier, was quick to say that that's not going to be the case. Actually, there will be a lot of judgment on top of this. So I wish they'd say guided by the data instead of following the data. That suggests too much that they're just going to do what the data tells them to do. And of course, data cannot tell you what to do.
Indeed, but it can be a cause for concern. Are there any sets of the data that, when you look at, make you worried?
Okay, let me just go through. If we look at the NHS data, new admissions to hospital extraordinary, less than half what they were a month ago, dropping around 20% per week. It looks like it's dropping a bit faster in older groups, which is great, because that again is compatible with the effect of the vaccine. People in hospital, it's half what it was at the peak, still high. But coming down every day. Death rates, it's extraordinary, really. How fast they're coming down, and they're currently halving about every 2 weeks or so, and again faster in older groups. Big drop in outbreaks in care homes and so on. So all this is very encouraging. Cases coming down there. It used to be 60,000 a day reported, and now it's down to around 10,000 a day. Been halving every 2 to 3 weeks, and so on. So these are all really encouraging signs, and that's happening across the country. A good rates it well. We'd expect it since schools have been closed. Kids haven't been getting infections, so those are coming down fast. There is, of course, areas of the country with still quite a lot of cases, even few have seen a small rise, but I don't think we should worry too much about that. But some which are still really quite substantial numbers, and these are pockets around the country. You mentioned earlier that there is this figure of 50 new cases per 100,000 per week as being a sort of level when WHO have said things might open up. Southwest is around that already. Many areas are below 100, but some are above 200 scattered around. And that is obviously of concern. And I suppose, actually, the thing that actually most concerns me is this fantastic vaccine rollout that's gone on, beyond anyone's hope, I think, in terms of the availability, the take-up, and so on. But it is slower in some communities, and in some ethnic communities in particular. And it's really unfortunate because these communities have already been hit very hard indeed. And so I think this is, unless we can, see greater take-up, I think this is going to be an increasing issue because clearly, I'm not going to guess what Boris is going to say tomorrow, but I think what I understand is that they're going to try to have, national measures rather than regional tiered systems, since that would cause such a lot of problems. But it seems to me that there's still going to be a need for highly local measures that might have to take place.
That's very interesting. Gosh, there's a lot to unpack in that answer.
Sorry, I rattled it all off then.
We'll get through it all because it was all so interesting. So you talked about some areas of the countries with higher infection rates, hotspots, I suppose. Does the data tell us anything about what sort of where the infection rate is most problematic in which areas of the country?
Yes, yeah. We actually, it's very nice. The excellent government dashboard, which I must say, give real credit to them for putting this out. It's got a very good map, and you can see little color-coded areas. For me, I'm in Cambridge, so I see around Peterborough it's quite high, and other pockets around the country where it is quite high. And you can see, well, they measure if you want to get down below 50. You can see that I would say, the Southwest and other areas, rural areas, are doing that. Others, and it is focused, does tend to be focused in areas with deprivation, high density housing, and so on. And these are areas that have been hard hit already. So, in a way, I don't think it's too surprising what we're seeing going on. But it is coming down everywhere. So, really there is a uniform improvement pretty well across the country, across regions, which is why I think that I understand that we're going to have uniform measures from now on as far as possible and not have a tier system.
Yes, you may not want to go into this, but does that surprise you that given differential rates, differential demographic trends, that we will go national rather than local?
I think because I still think I will interest. I'm sure they'll leave room for, in a way, highly local interventions and measures. That's what I think might happen. That on general, they'll try to have a general same rule across the whole country, because it saves argument and it does make it simpler to understand. But I think that they're going to have to keep. And I don't like making judgments. I don't know what they're going to do. I'm glad it's not my job. But I think they're going to have to keep the possibility of having much more targeted interventions in certain areas.
I think you listen
because
to
I think
Matt.
this. Sorry. Yeah, remember Matt Hancock earlier on was saying that it's going to be a lot like flu and things like that. We're going to have to get used to this, and I think one aspect of it that we're going to have to get used to is the fact that we'll be possibly much more of a focus on outbreaks in particular areas, rather than something blanket across the whole, a rise across the whole country. It's likely to be much more focused and targeted.
The other thing that Matt Hancock said to us is that each time a restriction is lifted, we're going to have to pause to see the impact of a particular easing. Now, he said data can take up to a few weeks, but I thought I would ask the best person on data to ask you how long data takes to measure.
I really respect this approach, to be honest, rather than just saying we'll do this and at this date we'll do this, because there is so much uncertainty. Another new variant could crack in. I mean, look what happened before Christmas. We're actually doing quite well. End of November, cases were low, not quite as low as they are now, but pretty low. And then, measures got relaxed. Isn't that lovely? 5 days of Christmas. And look what happened. They shot up. We're still trying to get that peak down again, largely fed by this new variant. We had to mess up Christmas and things like that. So I think they're quite right to be very cautious. Things can change, and we noticed they could change pretty rapidly. That's, quite worrying. And so I think, and people usually, I think I agree, sort of 3 weeks to have a feeling for what's happening, so that any impact can feed through into the chance to let people see what the infection's going up, whether how sharply that's rising, and so on. So I do like this idea of an adaptive strategy, and it's something I wish they'd done right from the beginning, of admitting the uncertainty. And there's so much we still don't know, and things we can be taken by surprise, and therefore we have to be able to adapt. And we don't want to be doing it at the last minute, as we've seen, because that really causes trouble. But we do have to be flexible and adapt to what we see.
In your earlier answer, which I commented had so much in it to unpack, you
Sorry.
also mentioned vaccine and the differentiation in take-up among some communities. Is there a data point where that becomes a concern? If it's, I won't put words in your mouth, but if one particular community has X percent of vaccination, particularly low, does that become a problem for all of us? Does the data tell us things like that?
If there's not too much circulating virus, it's not too much of a problem for anybody, because it depends on what's there. But I know, no, I wouldn't really want to put a figure on it or anything like that. So, but I think it just is. It's so useful, particularly now we're going to get the vaccine rolled out to everybody really rapidly. I think that's such a it's going to be such a benefit to society, because every time someone's vaccinated, although we're not quite sure yet the extent to which it prevents infection, but it's like it definitely has some effect. Infecting, passing it on. So every time someone's vaccinated, they're helping themselves and they're helping other people. So by being vaccinated, it's both a contribution to yourself, your family, and the community around you. And so I think that I know all I can say is that it's very good if rates are high in across the whole country.
That's fine. Let's look at the number of people in intensive care. Are the numbers likely to become one of the last things to fall? The number of people in intensive care.
Yes, that's that. I think people have been very clear about that for some time. I mean, people on in mechanical ventilation, because that's not not everybody in intensive care is on that. That is dropping. But if I'm just looking at the graphs in front of me right now, and it's not dropping as fast as the number of people in hospital in general. It's not dropping as far as deaths and so on. Yeah, because particularly with the vaccine, we've amazing protection now to over 70s and to younger groups now. But most people in intensive care are under 70. These are people in intensive care, and average age is about 60 or so, and there's a lot of younger people, and it's that in a way that this extraordinary. God, it's a vile disease. It really is nasty. It picks on some people, and we still don't quite know why. I'm not a doctor, of course, but it just seems to exaggerate any sort of vulnerability and weakness somebody has got, and so you get these really surprising, young people suddenly have a very bad when I mean middle aged, very bad effect of getting an infection, and they find themselves in intensive care. And that will be the last thing to change, because it's going to take a long time it won't change until the virus stops sort of circulating in the community. It will come down, but there's going to be a pressure for a lot longer on those. So, really, one can only just repeat again the respect for the people who are working here, and the families that are having to deal with their relations being there when they can't visit them. They might get they get a daily report, and they might be able to talk to them possibly, but they're really tough for everybody.
Some people focus on excess deaths to reflect whether we're back to normal or not. Is that a useful measure?
Oh, yeah, no, okay. Let me get going on this. I think this is. I do. I'm a statistician, so I unfortunately sit around counting deaths, and we can see that COVID deaths are coming down. They're halving every 2 weeks or so, running at about 400 or 500 a day. Now that means certainly by when we get into March, and I think confidently they'll be down to under 200 a day. Now at that point, there'll still be 200 a day COVID deaths, really bad, but it's quite plausible that we won't then have any excess deaths. And in other words, deaths would be back to normal for the time of year. Looking back over the last 5 years, I thought, whoa, what's going on? And that's because in this second wave, we're getting actually, almost historically, fewer deaths by other conditions going on at the moment. So, for example, in the last week of data from ONS, we had 7,000 COVID deaths, but only 5,000 excess deaths. So that means there's fewer deaths. People are dying from other things. Now, okay, the three reasons, first of all, I think I can go through. First is that some of those deaths, COVID deaths, as people often say, would have happened anyway. They were people dying with COVID, and they died of something else as their main cause. But that's actually not a huge number. Only about 10% of COVID deaths don't have it as the primary underlying cause of death. So that allows for some of it. The other thing is there's no flu. I mean, that flu is nothing like as infectious as COVID. And so the measures we're all taking, all our social distancing, if we did this all the time, heaven forbid, there wouldn't be, we wouldn't have to worry about flu, because it stops essentially flu circulating. So normally we get, 10, 20,000 people every winter dying of flu, and that's not happening. So that's a good thing. And the other reason why there's fewer deaths at the moment from other causes is very sadly because they've already happened. The 60,000 excess deaths we had in the spring, many of those vulnerable elderly people would otherwise have lived another year or so and have died now. So they've been brought forward by the previous wave. And so what that means on the whole is that I use excess deaths all the time to compare this country with other countries, because you can't rely on what people label as COVID deaths. But I'm anxious that next month somebody's going to say, oh, well, look, we haven't got any excess deaths. We're normal. Why have we got all these restrictions? And they will say that. So I'm just preempting that. That will be an argument that's made. And I'm just preempting it to say, no, actually, things are not normal. Things are not normal, and we still will have to be very cautious.
Got you. That was very clear. What does the data tell us about the effect of the vaccine on infections and the death rate now?
Yes, yeah, I did say a little bit about that. It's, I mean, I suppose I'd hope to see a slightly more obvious signal. The problem is that, as I said, things are getting better so rapidly on infections, on admissions, and on deaths that what you're trying to do is spot the difference between one group getting better and another group getting better a little bit faster. And no, there is evidence that deaths in the over 85s and the over 70s are dropping faster than deaths, for example, in the under 65s who have not been vaccinated yet. And similarly for hospital admissions. It's not dramatic yet, but I think it's a strong enough signal to say it's certainly compatible with an effect of the vaccine, and that will only increase. The data coming out of Israel is hugely encouraging, really very encouraging indeed, because they've done this extraordinary rollout where half the population has now been vaccinated, and we are, of course, cracking along and doing a fantastic job at vaccinating our population. So we are going to see, these serious reductions coming down now, and they will come right down in terms of deaths and serious hospitalizations. But that's still, we've got to be very cautious because, in a way, a big surge in cases among lower risk people who've not been vaccinated yet, even though they are lower risk and they're much less likely to actually be hospitalized and die, if there's a real explosion, the sort of thing we were seeing before Christmas, if this happens again, even among lower risk people, we would still see huge pressure on the NHS. And the government, they'll be sitting there with their models and their dashboards, and they'll be looking at all of this the whole time.
So, David, good morning. It's Tom here.
Hi.
Can I just ask you about the one thing that's been bothering me all morning, quite frankly? We tried this with Matt Hancock, we tried this with David Lammy. This idea put up by Tony Blair and others that the government should very closely link various stages of unlock to numeric targets of case reduction. So, for example, Tony Blair says non-essential retail shouldn't open unless cases are below 50 out of 100,000, or pubs shouldn't open unless cases are below 10 out of 100,000. Government seems reluctant to do that, but clearly, I mean, they want their wiggle room. But is that the correct thing to do from a statistician's point of view?
No, I don't think so. Obviously, one should be guided by it, but I don't like the idea of data governing policy. These are political decisions. Data does not tell you what to do at all. It guides you, it helps you. Of course, you look at this, but you have to balance and weigh it up among everything else about what the effect of your interventions might be, and so on. And these are judgments, these are political judgments. And as a statistician, I would never say that there should be some algorithm. If this is the case, then do that. The computer says no, the computer says yes, because we know how that can lead to anomalies, leads to a rigidity of behavior, lack of flexibility to local circumstances, and so on. So I think actually I think it's good to have some milestones and have some indicators, partly for communication of, so people can see what is a reasonable level, 50 per 100,000 per week, which is what we got in the Southwest now. That actually is quite a reasonable level. It's nothing like it. Remember, it was 20 per 100,000 per week for travel between countries back back some time ago. So I like the idea of looking at the data. I like the idea of trying to encourage people to understand what is a high number and what's a low number. I completely agree that this should not be a deterministic computer says no situation.
Final one from me. 1.7 million people have been added to the shielding group. Who are they and why have they been added?
Yeah, that's interesting because that is a completely statistical issue. And I got to admit, I was involved partly in the development of the algorithm that led to those 1.7 million people being added. And essentially it's based on a statistical analysis of the first wave of data. Now, the original shielding lists were made up way back in March or when we just didn't know what the effects of this virus was. So people, essentially just made them up on the spot. No, they weren't bad, but they just did make them up. And now, by analysing the data from the first wave, based on millions of general GP records, it enabled an algorithm to be constructed where you put in these factors. And this is both the risk of both catching it and dying from it. So it includes things like your postcode, which maps onto deprivation and ethnicity, and so things that increase your risk of catching it. It doesn't include job. That's not on GP databases, so we don't have that, although we know that is also a risk factor. So those factors go in and they produce a probability, essentially what proportion of people like you who tick those boxes died or were hospitalized in the first wave. And there's a rule they decided on, was that anybody that had an absolute risk in the first wave of greater than 1 in 200 of dying from COVID. So if you were in a group where more than 1 in 200 died from COVID, you'd go on the list. Or if you were more than 10 times the risk of somebody at the same age and sex who didn't have any illnesses, who didn't have any clinical conditions. So what they're trying to do is get people who are at high risk, and that would be very much focused on older people, but also younger people who were at high risk relative to their peers. Even if they weren't as high risk as an older person, they still, compared with people their age, were at high risk. And that was the criteria. And that led to 1.7 million people. So that is an example of a complete algorithmic decision.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that really is a
Absolutely
computer says yes,
fascinating.
no. Yeah.